Nobody wants to say anything?
Great, thank you. So welcome everybody. Welcome everybody from the Hampshire Bird Club, the Allen Bird Club, the Hoffman Bird Club. It's just so lovely that we can all gather for these wonderful workshops. Most of you, or many of you, may know Mike Locher. He's a member of the Hampshire Bird Club, an expert birder. He's led a lot of our bird walks, and if you haven't done one with him, you should. And we're really delighted he's going to do the Waterfowl ID workshop for us. So without any further ado, Mike, take it away.
All right, thank you, Leslie. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, that'll do. I'm going to try to share my screen now. So again, let me know if this works. You see a picture of a lot of blue-winged teal.
We see the picture.
Perfect. All right. So what I decided my program would be about tonight is the migrating waterfowl of the Connecticut River Valley. And this PowerPoint presentation I'll make available to Leslie and Laura and Janice and other members of the education committee so they can farm it out, or you can contact me directly and I can send it out to you if you want. So the plan is, the first thing we'll do is just talk about some general principles of waterfowl watching, like what to look for, how you should behave, things like that. Then I want to review the resident species of ducks that live here in the valley so that we have a way to contrast them with the species that are just passing through. And then I'll try to go through most of the valley's migrants, not absolutely all of them, but most of the birds you can find in the valley, pointing out one or two things about them that maybe should make you think, oh, that's what I've got, that's my species. And then at the end of the presentation, I've got a list of places that are good to see migrating waterfowl in the valley. And I'm specifically focusing on migrating waterfowl, which occurs over the next month and a half or so. There are different places that you go all during the winter, but this is to find the migrants. So first tip that I always use with particularly ducks is look for the white or light patches on the plumage. And so here I've got 3 different species. I've got a bufflehead in the lower left. I've got a wood duck in the middle, and I've got a long-tailed duck on the right. And the bufflehead has a very, very distinctive pattern. It's got that long white sort of oval shaped white patch on its head. The wood duck doesn't have much white this time of year. And one of the real difficulties with migratory birding is that the birds are often in what's called eclipse plumage. So they aren't going to show the gaudy colors that we see in the spring. This wood duck is a prime example. It's a female wood duck, which are not as colorful as the males, but nonetheless have beautiful plumage. And here the white is around the eye. If you can see that white around the eye, and it often has a little bit of a tail to it, then that's a good indication you've got a wood duck. And then the long-tailed duck is almost the exact reverse of the way it appears in the spring. In the spring, it's got a black top of the head and the face is white. Here, the face is gray and the top of the head is white. But noticing where the white is can be key because you're often looking at these birds from a long distance, and what really shows up are the light patches versus the dark patches. Second thing, scan for something different. If you come on a pond and you see lots and lots of waterfowl, the first thing I like to do is take out my binoculars and just scan through them, simply looking for something a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, a slightly different color, a different pattern, or different behavior. This duck is diving, most of them aren't. And I use that to focus my attention to find the birds that are more unusual. A a lot of what you'll see throughout the migration season is going to be some of our resident species, the mallards, the black ducks, the wood ducks. And so you got to learn to see what else is there with just a quick scan through the entire group of ducks that happens to be there. Now, of course, as soon as I say this, someone will say that they found an unusual duck and it was a mallard because it happened to be among a bunch of rarities, but that's pretty rare. And then a big key whenever you're stalking ducks is don't spook them. Some of the species that are more used to human beings, the mallards, Canada geese, they are very, very difficult to flush. But a lot of the smaller ducks, particularly the teals and some of the others, will take off if they hear a loud noise like a car door slamming, they see a big movement that they don't understand, like a person waving their arms for someone else to come over and look through their scope. So try to be somewhat careful when you're moving in the vicinity of ducks, even if you're a fair distance off, because they can get spooked and then they'll fly away and it can be very, very difficult to find them. Now on to the ducks. So the first duck, and the one that is by far the most common here in the valley, we have them year round, is the mallard. And you'll notice that even though this is a male mallard, it doesn't have the bright green head that we're used to for the spring and the summer. This is an example of what's called the eclipse plumage, which is different than the breeding plumage. However, I still sort of like the idea of focusing on the white patches of the animal. And the white patches here are along the tail. So if you look along the tail, it's a diagonal, rising diagonal there. Those tail feathers on a mallard tend to be white and they tend to be very visible. You also get those two white stripes along the speculum. That's that blue patch that you find on the wings of ducks. That's where the white is on a mallard, and you'll find it on both male mallards and female mallards in the fall. Another thing to know about mallards is they are a fairly large duck. They're about the largest duck that we're going to see passing through the valley at any point in time. Even a common merganser is the size of a mallard, tip to tail. Mallard's a little bit bulkier. So mallards are going to tend to look like the biggest bird in a group of ducks, unless you happen to have geese present. Another one of our residents, although they're much, much fewer and further between in the winter, is a wood duck. And again, these fall birds look nothing like the spring birds that we see pictures of in birding calendars and when they're displayed in bird books. But nonetheless, they do have certain distinctive features. The white on these two birds, the male is on the top, the female's on the bottom. You can see it's on the throat of the male. So if you're looking at this bird, it's early morning, you've got a scope across a quiet pond, you're basically just going to see a dark bird. You may not pick up on the fact that the bill has a lot of color to it. You're not going to see the color in the eye. But what you can see is that white throat pattern. And it's a very distinctive pattern. Only male wood ducks have that. The female has that white around her eye, as I pointed out in the earlier slide. And here you can see the little tail on the white. You can also see a little bit of a white border on the speculum of the female wood duck, although that's something that a lot of the dabbling ducks share. Other things about wood ducks, they tend to have long plumes at the back of their heads. And that's particularly evident when you see the spring breeding plumage, but even in the fall, they've got those long plumes on the back. And this is a much smaller duck than the mallard. Another thing to notice about wood ducks is they've got sort of a back and forth motion of their heads as they swim around. So if you're scanning a bunch of ducks and a lot of them are moving and their necks are relatively stationary, but you've got a few who have sort of a back and forth motion on the neck, chances are pretty good those are wood ducks. Then the other species, and this is a species that's pretty seldom seen during the summer, but during the winter, they in some places are almost as common as mallards, and that's the American black duck. And even though I said always look for the white, one of the good clues to the American black duck is that they don't have any white at all. So notice there's no white along the tail. You can't see much of a speculum. The bird in the back has a little dark blue patch, but you'll notice it's not bordered with a thick white boundary like the mallard is. So these are black ducks. And while black ducks can be relatively easy to separate from mallards when they're right next to each other, if you see black ducks with no mallards present, it can be a little bit dicey about which bird you've got. They're obviously darker in comparison to the mallards, but when they're by themselves, depending on the light, they can look relatively bright. So there are some technical features of the feathering that allow you to very confidently say whether it's a black duck or whether it's a mallard. But I think for this webinar, I just want to say these are dark ducks. They're the same size as mallards, but they're not going to show any white at all. So those are our residents. Those are the things that we can expect to see pretty much all year round. And they make nice comparisons for the birds that really just pass through the area. One of those birds, and they are passing through right now, is the green-winged teal. They start in early October and they finish up somewhere around November, and they are leaving the area. You are not going to find green-winged teal around here in the winter unless it's a really, really hardy bird. There is very, very little for you to latch onto when you're trying to identify this duck. They basically look brown. There is a white patch near the tail. In the top bird, you can see that there's a little white, or sometimes it looks like a creamy patch near the tail. Not as obvious as the patch that you focus on for a green-winged teal in the spring, but there is that patch near the tail. And if you happen to see the speculum, it's a beautiful green color, which is where the duck gets its name. Beyond that, you're looking at the size of the green-winged teal. It's a very small duck. It's not our smallest. Our smallest is the bufflehead, but this is just half an inch bigger than the bufflehead on average. And if you happen to be scanning a group of ducks and you see a couple that are much smaller, that seem to be moving very, very quickly, often sort of in the background, they tend to like to be at the edges, and they tend to like to be at the far edge of whatever pond you're at least that's my experience, then you've got a good chance that you're looking at a green-winged teal. Another one, and these are pretty unusual in the valley, is a gadwall. They probably pass through and they may not always be noticed, but they move through in relatively small numbers through October and November. One of the key features of gadwalls all year long is that bright white patch you see in both of the birds here. Again, I've got the male on the top and I've got the female on the bottom. The male has beautifully patterned feathers, but when they're in eclipse plumage, that feathering is not nearly as dramatic as we see on that male that I've got in the picture. However, that white patch on the wing is going to be there all year round. The bird on the bottom is one that looks more like both sexes in the winter. This happens to be a female, and if you can't see that white patch, you've got a little bit of a problem, because it looks brown the same way a female mallard looks brown. So how do you separate them? Well, the gadwall's smaller. So if you happen to have a female mallard nearby, then the gadwall will look like a shorter, slightly stumpier bird. And the bill looks different too. The bill on the gadwall, if you look at the top picture, looks fairly sharp and fairly thin top to bottom. And sometimes you can pick that out. Also, if you look at the bottom picture, the female, looks like it has a fairly short bill, which is not the way a mallard bill looks. Next up, the American widgeon. The male American widgeon is really, really obvious in the spring, but in eclipse plumage, it gets much less obvious. One particular feathering detail that it has and is very obvious in the fall is that bright white patch it gets up on its wing. Other than that, the belly is white, but usually with the bird on the water, you're not going to be seeing the belly at all. So the gadwall is going to be, the male is going to be fairly easy to see because of that white patch that's usually pretty visible, not always. But the female you can see on the bottom has no white patches at all. Instead, you'll notice that both sexes have a very, very dark smudge around the eye. And that dark smudge, which can be difficult to see unless you've got a scope and pretty good light, that dark smudge is often the key. Again, these birds are smaller than mallards. So if you scan through a group and you see some birds that look a little bit smaller, then widgeon might be one of the options. And one thing you'll often see with all of these birds, even though they're in eclipse plumage, is they might still show some of the features of their breeding plumage. So in the case of an American widgeon, the male would have white all along the top of the head. But this is a full eclipse plumage. It's not anywhere close to still being in molt phase. So it has a head that just sort of looks speckled and gray. Northern pintails. Northern pintails are relatively common coming through the valley during October and November, and they will often be in flocks with mallards, with black ducks, with other ducks. And this is a case where when I scan, I can often pick out a pintail, if it happens to be there, just based on the way it looks, sort of the general size, the slenderness of the neck. They look much, much more delicate than the mallards and the black ducks, which are big, beefy ducks. A couple other things to notice about the northern pintail. They've got long feathers, hence the name pintail, much longer projection of those tail feathers than you'll find in any of the other ducks passing through the valley. They've also got all dark bills. They never have anything but dark black bills. Males sometimes show a hint of their spring breeding plumage pattern, which is sort of a long white curl that goes up their neck, but that isn't always present, so you can't rely on that. And that's pretty much all the dabblers that we have passing through the valley. Dabblers are those ducks that feed primarily on vegetable matter, and they do it primarily by tipping, like these two mallards are doing, and picking that food off the bottom of a pond or a stream or wherever they happen to be. For this reason, most of them tend to stay in fairly shallow water because they can't feed if the water is more than about a foot deep. So you'll tend to see all of them at the edges of ponds if they are genuinely dabblers. One thing to note about these mallards, one reason I know they're mallards is because of the tail feathers on the rear bird. You see those two little curled plumes. That's one of the key features of male mallards when they're in breeding plumage. Sometimes when they're in eclipse plumage as well, but it's a little bit rarer there. I skipped a couple of the dabblers. I skipped northern shoveler, which is very difficult to find in the valley. And I skipped blue-winged teal because they have actually already passed through for the most part. There are other places not in the valley where you can see both of those species, but they don't really seem to come through the valley very much. Now we're going to move on to ducks that behave very differently. These are ducks that are going to be in the center of ponds. They're not going to tip up like these two mallards to feed. Instead, they're called often bay ducks or diving ducks, and we've got a lot of them that move through the valley. One of the most common species that moves through the valley is called the ringneck duck. This, to a certain extent, is a misnomer because what's most obvious about the ringneck duck is actually the ring on its bill. There is a glossy ring, which you can't see at all on this picture of the duck in eclipse plumage, but the ring on the bill, where there is some white, should be one of the things that you can focus on and see and would enable you to identify this duck very, very confidently. They do have slightly paler sides. I wouldn't call it white, but the sides are noticeably paler than the back and the neck of the duck. But the key here is that white ring around the bill. And if you can see it, the orange eye. Females may also have an additional pale eye ring, but typically ringneck ducks are in mixed sex flocks. They tend to move in large groups. So it's relatively rare that you'd find an individual female ringneck duck all by yourself without a male there to help you confirm the identification. Next up, one of my favorites is the bufflehead. And the picture of the bufflehead at the top is the male bufflehead. It is not going to look like this in the fall. That gloss that you see on the feathers is lacking in the eclipse plumage, but the males still look remarkably similar in the fall. The whites aren't quite as bright, so they're a little bit dingier, but they have that big white wedge that goes from their eye the whole way through the back of the head. They tend to spread that out when they are in breeding mode. They're trying to attract mates, and they can close it down to look like sort of a long white oval on the back of their head. On the other hand, the female also shows white. This is a female in eclipse plumage, and she's got that oval below and behind her eye. She's also got a little bit of white down there on the wing. But the key features of this duck are that it's extremely small. This is our smallest duck, and they are divers, and they are very, very active divers. In fact, most of the time when I see buffleheads, I have difficulty really identifying it because it spends so much time underwater. I glimpse it, it dives. I glimpse it again, it dives again. And it's very, very difficult to see the bird well. If you happen to see them just sitting quietly, they're usually pretty easy to identify, but they do tend to move a lot. However, just the fact that they are so small, they'll be in the middle of ponds, they'll be in the middle of rivers, means that you can be pretty certain you've got a bufflehead, even when you can't see any other parts of it. They also have prominent white on the wings. So if you happen to see them in flight, they'll show a lot of white on the wings, and your field guides can give you a good idea of what that pattern looks like. Another duck, we have these all winter long here in the valley, are common golden eyes. They tend to migrate into the valley in October. They stay through the winter, and they leave somewhere around April, early May. The males, you'll notice, have a round white spot in front of the eye. And there's also Barrow's golden eye, which occasionally shows up. They've got a different shape to that white spot. For the common golden eye, you're looking for a fairly round spot in front of the eye. You'll also notice on the male that even though you probably in winter won't see that green glossy color to it, nonetheless, you will see that sort of peak look to the head. So if you see that white spot in front of the eye and kind of a peaked look to the head and the golden eye, you can bet that that's what they have. In their winter plumage, that bright white that you see on the neck and the sides of this bird is a little bit muted, but the basic plumage pattern remains the same. The female doesn't really have much in the way of obvious white. They basically look like gray birds with brown heads. But again, common golden eyes tend to move in relatively large mixed sex flocks. And so often if you can identify the males, then you can see that the other birds with them are females. Sometimes they've got that yellow tip to the bill, which is visible from a great distance, but usually they don't. These birds are often very, very well seen right in the Connecticut River here in Hadley, where I live. There are a couple spots along the river where you can walk down to the riverbank and see the birds all winter long. Then two of the really toughies, the greater and lesser scaup. These are really unusual here in the valley. They are a bird that definitely prefers larger lakes and the ocean coast, and they tend not to migrate through the valley. However, they do occasionally hit the larger lakes, places like the Quabbin Reservoir or the Connecticut River, and every now and then single birds show up. Relatively infrequently do you get more than one or two birds. It tends to be very, very small groups. These birds are divers again. So they're going to be out in the middle of a lake. They're going to be away from the edge of the rivers. Eclipse males are very, very dark. That's the greater scaup in the top picture with the lesser scaup in the lower picture. And you can probably see from this that these birds are very, very difficult to separate. Some of the key field marks are things like the size of the nail on the end of the bill. And the nail is the very, very tip of the bill. It turns out the greater scaup has a much larger black nail than the lesser scaup, but that is almost impossible to see from any kind of distance. So what people tend to focus on is the shape of the head. And the lesser scaup tends to have a head that looks more pointed on top. The greater scaup tends to have a much more rounded looking head. If you happen to see them side by side, the greater scaup is actually much larger than the lesser scaup. So it would be no difficulty, you'd have no difficulty telling them apart if they were side by side. The problem is they are very seldom side by side. They don't tend to convene, particularly during migration. So you're stuck looking at these birds that superficially seem very, very similar. Then one of the more beautiful ducks that passes through the valley this time of year is the long-tailed duck. And the male is nearly unmistakable. It's got all of that white all over it. It's got those long tail plumes. It's got that dark bill with the orangish coloration on it as well. It's got that beautiful set of crescents over the eye. If you see one of these, you're very lucky, and it's just a gorgeous bird. It is something to just watch and admire. The females, on the other hand, this time of year also have a significant amount of white on them. You'll notice the entire head is white, and that's the only species of duck that passes through the valley that's got an entirely white head like that. They've also got a significant amount of white near the tail. So both of these birds should be pretty easy to identify if you just remember to look for the white. The scoters. I'm going to go through all three of the scoter species here, and about the only place you're likely to see the scoters is out at the Quabbin Reservoir. So they could land in the river, but it's very seldom that I see any reports of scoters landing in the river. On the other hand, if you go out to the coast, there are scoters all over the place, often quite close to shore. So if you really want to see a scoter, you should probably go out to the coast. However, prowling around Quabbin Reservoir can be a good way to see them. And all three scoter species have been seen out at the Quabbin Reservoir within the past 2 weeks. These are the black scoters. They migrate through the valley from October through November, and they are very, very dark. There's very little white on these birds at all. The best field mark for the male is that bright orange yellow knob on its bill, and that shows up as kind of a light patch. If you get a good look at it, it shows up as a bright yellow or bright orange patch. Females are much more subtle, and the female has a slightly paler cheek. It's contrasting with the cap of the bird, which is quite dark, and the body of the bird, which is sort of a dark brown. So that pale cheek can show up in the right light from a long distance. But one of the things about black scoters is because they have no white, and because they're going to tend to be around white-winged scoters and surf scoters, which do show white, you can often pick them out. They're a little bit smaller than the other scoter species, but they are a fairly large duck. So one thing to look for, if you happen to go out to the Quabbin and you see a large group of ducks out there, just scope through them and look for any birds that don't show bright colors. And here's a fair bet that you've got black scoters in that group. The surf scoter, on the other hand, has a larger bill, it's got a longer body, and it does show white patches. So the male shows that white patch on the back of its neck, it shows another white patch on the forehead, and then it's got a huge clown bill with black, white, and orange all over it. All of these marks show up from a long distance because the duck is so dark. Those bright white patches really shine out. And even on the female, which is not quite as black in its plumage, has 2 white spots on its head. One of them in front of the eye, between the eye and the bill, and the other one behind the eye. It's a slightly more oblong patch. So contrast that with the black scoters, where there was very, very little to grab onto for the female or even the male in poor light when you might not see that orange knob. Comparing them with the surf scoters, the white patches on the males will definitely show up in any kind of light. And on the females, they tend to show up as well. And then you've got white-winged scoters. And white-winged scoters, again, they're coming through the valley at the same time. They're often in groups that include the black scoters and the surf scoters. And the white-winged scoters have, big surprise here, white wings. The wings aren't entirely white, but they've got a significant amount of white on their wings. And it's significant enough that you can see them even when the birds are on the water. So you see the male up above and the female down below. Both of them, you can see that white patch in the rear third of its body. Other things to note is that the face of the white-winged scoter has another distinctive bill on the male, whereas on the female, it's got a pair of white patches that are very, very similar to the surf scoter. However, notice the rear patch on this white-winged scoter is very, very round. Whereas if we go back to the surf scoter, you can see that that rear patch is much more oval or oblong. So it can be a very, very difficult thing to say if you just see the heads. Is it a surf scoter? Is it a white-winged scoter? But the white-winged scoter does have that white patch on the wing to help you separate them. So these scoters are birds where you can be sitting at park headquarters, Windsor Dam, out at the Quabbin, and you can get your scope out and you can scan this flock of ducks off in the distance. And even if you can't pull the ducks into complete focus, you can typically see these white wing patches. You can see the white on the back of the neck of the surf scoter, and you'll see other birds that just look dark, that don't show any white at all. And you can use those as clues to distinguish the three species of scoters. All right. I think I've wrapped up my species accounts, and I want to leave some time for any questions that people might have. But I wanted to go through places to look for migrating ducks. And moving from south to north along the Connecticut River Valley, here's some of the prime spots to look for ducks. One of them is the Fanny Stebbins Wildlife Refuge in Longmeadow, and that's great right now. They've got a lot of ponds and little waterways along the Longmeadow Brook, and that attracts a large variety of dabbling ducks. So you'll get mallards, you'll get black ducks, but they've had both species of teal just within the past several days. If a shoveler's going to show up somewhere in the valley, there's a fair chance it's going to show up down here at Fanny Stebbins. They've got widgeons, they've got gadwalls. So if you're looking for variety and you're looking for those dabbling ducks, Fanny Stebbins is often an excellent place to go. Another place is Ashley Reservoir in Holyoke. I've always had better luck there in the spring, but Ashley Reservoir is deep enough that it can support both dabblers and diving ducks. And I think of Ashley Reservoir as a good place for ringneck ducks in particular. Sometimes you've got to go exploring some of the side ponds as opposed to the main reservoir in order to find some of the ducks, but they are out there at the Ashley Reservoir. Then another place I like to stop is South Hadley Canal Park, which is in South Hadley. It's pretty close to the dam, but it's a little bit upstream of the dam. And what I like about it is they've got a viewing platform there where you can set up a scope and you can scan up and down the river. In addition to ducks, you're likely to see mute swans there. You're likely to see a lot of Canada geese. And the ducks that you see are going to tend to be a long way off. So you really need a scope if you're going to be there. But I've seen both dabblers and divers there. So it can be a good place for those migratory ducks. Not really in the valley, but it's worth a mention nonetheless, is the Quabbin Reservoir, which is Belchertown and Ware. And some of the good viewing spots are right at the park headquarters. You can set up a scope and scan out in front and see what you can find. And then there's another place called Hanks Meadow or Gate 52, which is on the loop road that goes through the reservoir. And then there's the Goodenough Dike. And I've often had better luck with scoters down around the Goodenough Dike than I have at Windsor Dam, although most of the recent sightings have been from the Windsor Dam area. Dabblers occur all over Quabbin Reservoir, but it's really best known for its diving ducks. So if you're looking for the long-tailed duck, if you're looking for scaup, if you're looking for scoters, Quabbin Reservoir is one of the places you'll go, and if you're fortunate, you'll find a few. Moving further north, you've got Hadley Cove, here where I live in Hadley, and it's a small sheltered cove off the Connecticut River, and it can have a surprising number of species in it. Mostly it's dabblers, but occasionally you get some diving ducks in there. There was a scaup a couple years ago that showed up there for a little while. Be aware that parking is very, very limited. And if you don't know how to get down to the cove or how to see the cove, it's good to ask an experienced birder how to do it, because you can drive down the road and not really see anything that looks like promising birding there. Great Pond in Hatfield can be a phenomenal place for migratory ducks, particularly dabblers, but parts of it are deep enough to also have the diving ducks. One thing you want to be aware of whenever you go to Great Pond is you probably want to go on a Sunday this time of year, because Great Pond is heavily hunted. I went there last Saturday and had a number of hunters show me the green-winged teal they just shot. I didn't see many live birds that particular day, so definitely go on Sundays if you want to see ducks. And then the whole way up to Turner's Falls and Gill, you've got Barton Cove. And this is another deep water location. Dabblers occur around the edges, but divers are often the focus. And often during the winter, you'll find very unusual species that show up around Barton Cove or the Turner's Falls Power Canal. But if you just go up there, there are a couple places where you can set up a scope or sit there with your binoculars and scan the water. And you often have a lot of ducks. So it's good practice for just scanning through a flock and noticing what's a little bit different, focusing on those species, and then going from there, trying to figure out what it is you're actually seeing. You'll probably notice that I've left off a huge number of spots. And some of these spots are great for ducks in winter, like the Turner's Falls Power Canal or the Liberty Street Bridge in East Hampton, because the water stays open all winter long. So if there's an unusual duck, it's going to show up where the water's open. There are a couple others like the Turner's Falls Rod and Gun Club, which has always been a great place. I'm not sure about current access to it. It's always been easy. They tolerated birders who go down there and look, but I didn't want to add to my list and have somebody tell me that, oh no, they don't want birders there anymore. But there are lots and lots of places for ducks. If you're interested in a longer trip, last spring, I happened on 2 different occasions to go out to the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, which is in upstate New York. It's a long drive. It's about 4 hours each way, but they've got lots of blue-winged teal and northern shoveler and redheads, things that we just don't see in the valley very often, particularly the redheads. But they've got them by the hundreds over there. It's a great place for shorebirds and a great place for ducks. So that would be a place, if you wanted to go a little further afield, you didn't want to go out to the coast, that you could try. Currently, they allow hunting on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So you probably want to avoid those days and choose another one. Another plug that I'd like to make is that you should definitely check the Hampshire Bird Club trip list for the upcoming trips, because as I look over the next month and a half worth of trips, I see that probably 80% of them are specifically focused on waterfowl. And they include trips out to the Berkshire Lakes, trips to Ashley Reservoir, trips up to Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area in Vermont. So a whole bunch of trips, some of them quite local, some of them a little further afield, and a lot of them are focused on waterfowl. So if you're interested in ducks, you've got a lot of opportunity to get out there with a few leaders and see what's going on. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask, or any comments, or you can type it into the chat. And I guess I'll hand it back to Leslie or answer questions as they come.
Any questions?
What about Eurasian widgeons?
Eurasian widgeons are really, really uncommon here. They can certainly show up, but they're very similar to the American widgeons in a lot of ways. So in eclipse plumage, I honestly wouldn't be confident making that call. If they're in spring plumage, there are a couple of features that you can see that are a little bit different. You know, the Eurasian has a line along its flanks, but eclipse plumage, no, I'm not going to try.
Yeah.
Good question.
Well, I've seen them in the West Coast. I was just curious if I had much luck out here.
Yeah, probably not. You'd have better
Yeah.
luck out on the coast, I think. In the valley here,
Mhm.
there have been a handful of reports over the past 10 years, but
Okay.
they are definitely not common.
So there's a question in the chat from
Yep.
David C. Are there any species that are rare in the valley that might be seen in the Berkshires?
Ruddy duck.
Hmm.
Ruddy duck is one we tend not to see in the valley. A couple of them show up. That was one I left off, but they typically do show up on the Berkshire Lakes trip. And beyond that, I'm not sure you're likely to see anything particularly unusual for the valley, but it is a great trip because you tend to see a lot of species on a lot of different reservoirs. And every now and then there's something a little bit unusual, and the leaders will know where those birds are and will take you to them. But I would say ruddy duck is the one that's pretty well guaranteed out there that you just don't find around here.
I have a question.
Sure.
What about the Oxbow Marina as a place to find migrating ducks?
Yeah, I would think that that would be great, but I've never had much luck there. So it seems like a perfect spot for both dabblers and divers. And a few ducks show up, but it seems to be better in the spring than in the fall.
Oh, okay.
Definitely try it because it's got the kind of characteristics you want. But I just haven't had good luck there. Other questions? No one's going to try and stump me about some weird plumaged thing or harass me for not talking about cackling geese. No one?
I have a question for you, Mike. This is Janice. Your best
Uh-oh.
duck. Your best duck.
My best duck?
Yeah, or your duck you love the best, or you had the greatest view, or
I love blue-winged teal. I think they're unusual enough that when I see one, I get really excited. And I just think that pale blue on the front of their wings is really, really beautiful. And they're small, they're kind of cute. I happened to see about a week ago at Liberty Street Bridge in East Hampton, I happened to see 7 blue-winged teal, and they were doing this funny synchronized feeding where they would all be upright in the water and then they'd all tip and then they'd all pop up at once. And there's something about the size of the duck and the fact that they were doing that that just delighted me. So blue-winged teal would be my choice.
and the duck you most want to see that you haven't seen yet?
Ooh,
Yeah.
ooh. Anywhere in the world?
Sure. We'll zoom it
Mandarin
in
duck.
for you. A
Mandarin
mandarin.
duck. Yeah.
Ah. Not like the one in Central Park.
No,
That's not
I
really
want
a
it on its
wild
native
I
habitat.
know.
That's a
Okay.
city.
Maybe we could have an HBC field trip there to China.
Yeah, I'm not sure who would lead that. That would be a tough one.
So there is another question in the chat from Beth.
Yep.
She asks, where are these ducks migrating to and where did they start from?
All right, good question. And it really varies depending on the species. So some of the species are way up north, just on the edge of the Arctic Sea, and they're coming back down, and some of them are going just to the southern United States. I think a lot of the species that are passing through here are actually just going as far as the southern United States. They're not like the neotropical migrants that push further. A lot of them will go out to the coast. So you've got birds like Barrow's goldeneye that tend to like freshwater mountain ponds. for breeding or high tundra ponds, but then they come out to the coast, and some of them will be off the coast of Massachusetts, others will be off the coast of Maryland. So it really depends on the species, but a lot of what's passing through here right now are ducks that breed in Canada, and now they're coming through Massachusetts on their way, maybe only to Long Island Sound, but maybe further down the coast.
Anything else? Any other questions? Ah, there are
Eiders inland.
questions. Eiders.
Very, very rarely. Very, very rarely. I'm not going to say they never appear in the valley, because I'm sure they do, but I've never seen any of the eiders here in the valley. They tend to be very, very much a saltwater duck. And you can find them in the Cape Cod Canal, so not necessarily the ocean. You can find them all along the coast. Common eider in particular is very, very common, but maybe in a storm, they take refuge at Quabbin Reservoir, but it would be a really exceptional weather event to push them this far inland. Barrow's goldeneye do show up in the valley. One of the good places for that is Turner's Falls Power Canal, because when they show up, they tend to show up fairly late after ice is already forming. And the Turner's Falls Power Canal is open. They keep warm water flowing through it. So I think probably 3 of the 5 Barrow's goldeneyes I've seen in the valley have been in the Power Canal. So that would be the place I'd focus on. Other than that, just keep checking eBird. If you get eBird rare bird alerts, then that will highlight you to where the Barrow's goldeneyes show up. So not out of the question that they'd show up, but it's pretty unusual.
Okay, well, I want to thank you so much, Mike. This was just wonderful, really wonderful. We're all ready to go out and find those ducks.
I'll try. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.